We can look at this question about the Chesapeake and New England and how each region developed differently as a way to look at the kind of questions they'll ask on the AP test and the kind of skills that they'll ask you to use. We can look at this question here as highlight some of this. Although both the Chesapeake and New England colonies were settled by Englishmen, right, people from the same country, they developed into distinctly different societies. So the question is going to ask us, the prompt is explain the reasons for these differences. So this is a question that's good because a lot of times when this came out, people looked at this as a comparison essay, right? Asking you to compare to Chesapeake and New England, which is somewhat part of this, but really what this is asking you to do is asking you to explain why these reasons developed, right? So this is the big part of this. And this is really a cause and effect essay, when you think about it. We are looking for differences between the two, which would be, you think, a comparison, but the big part of this question is asking to explain the reasons for these differences. If you were to answer this question and just talk about the differences but not explain why they led, or what factors led to these differences, then you wouldn't get the points you would want for the essay, because you need to explain the cause and effect. So we think about some things that led to these different societies. We could look at, if we were writing this, we might make it some kind of brainstorming charts. We can put up here the two regions, the Chesapeake and New England. And we could, let's see, make a little line there. And then we could, over on the left-hand column, we could put, we could put causes and effects. And we want to be able to look at these and not just identify them, but also, if we were to write this essay, explain the connection between the causes and effects, how the causes led to the effects. So a few things we can look at here. We can look at, first of all, motives would be something for both of these. Oops. We can look at motives. If we think about in the Chesapeake, their motive was wealth. Right? The people that came to Virginia, those first settlers, left with a London company, a joint stock company, and they were looking to get rich. So they're hoping to find gold or silver or other precious metals or something, some kind of commodity they could use for money. When they realized that there wasn't a lot of that in North America, or at least not where they landed, they turned to other things. Like eventually tobacco became their source of wealth. If we look at motives for New Englanders, we can look at this idea of religious freedom. So the Pilgrims came. The Pilgrims were separatists, if you remember. They were people that thought the Anglican Church was beyond reform, so they came to start something entirely new. They did not want to go back. And even the Puritans really didn't have a sense of wanting to go back to England. They were non-separatists, but their idea was that they could create a society in America that would show the world how to live with Christian principles. You remember John Winthrop's City on a Hill speech, his Arbella speech, the model of Christian charity, where they would all act as Christian brothers and sisters, help each other out, and they'd show the world how they could live in Christian harmony, and they would show the Anglican Church the right way. So we have these motives that they both had. They're a little bit different. So their motives were different for each group. And before we look at how this leads to effects, let's also I want to look at settlers. Like who came? Maybe that's a better way to put it. Who came in some of these initial settlements? And in the Chesapeake, we have mostly young single men. If we look at this list of passengers aboard some of the boats, if you notice, if we look at this, this is in the year 1635, so it's not the first Jamestown settlers. This is about 20 years or so after Jamestown, a little less than 20 years after Jamestown got founded. But what we see here tells us a similar story to the 20 years before that. The ages of these passengers, mostly men. Like notice a small group over here, this is the only women. So not a lot of women came. And mostly men, and if you look at the ages, they're mostly in their 20s, in their teens. There's somebody finally in their 30s over here, a few 30s. There's a very few people of older ages. There's someone that's in their 40s, someone's in their 50s. But these are people that are, for most part, younger men looking to make their wealth and go back to England. If we compare that to New England, you can look at, again, the same year, 1635. So this is a little less time because Pilgrims came in 1620. The Puritans came a little bit later, so this is a little bit later after that settling. But the groups of people coming here, these settlers who came, we notice that these are family units, right? We see this first group of people. You have Joseph Hull, who is 40 years old. He comes with his wife, Agnes Hull, who is 25 years old, which I'll explain that in a bit, because that seems kind of strange for the year difference. His daughter, Joan, his son, Joseph, 15 and 13, his son, Tristan, who's 11, all the way down to the youngest kid, who's 3 years old. So this whole group here, this is a family that came together to Massachusetts. You think about why that's important, and then if you look below them, these are their servants that helped them out. So they paid their way. Those would be indentured servants who got paid for by Joseph Hull, and they're going to work for him for a period of years. Think why this is important. People that come in families, and you see a similar thing down here too. I should point out the Tabors, a family unit. We have the Lovels down here, another family unit. They're going to not be looking for wealth. They're looking for religious freedom. And the fact that they are coming as families tells you something different about who came or why that's important. So if we go back to looking at this, we can say who came for New England. These would be family units. So if we jump down, then we can look at, okay, what importance do these two things have? We can look at effects, motives, and who came for the Chesapeake. Young single men looking for wealth. We're going to have people working. There's going to be more, you might say, individualism. These people are going to be more competitive with each other, because if you think about, if you come to Jamestown, and even when they discover there's no gold or silver, if it comes down to making money off of growing tobacco, the more tobacco you grow, the less tobacco I can grow, because land is limited. So I have no interest in really helping you out, right? Even if we have the same amount of land, I don't have any interest in helping you farm it if you're having a hard time, because that means there's less tobacco I'm farming for myself. It's all about profits, right? So you can think about, that's something we put up here, slashes profits. So in the Chesapeake, we can look at how it develops. There's going to be less cooperation, more people looking out for themselves, working individually. Whereas in New England, we could say there's more of a sense of communal cooperation. You also think about this, also there's more sense of permanence. Looking at that, I think I spelled permanence wrong, but I'll ask you to excuse my spelling on that one. But you think about why that is, because if we look at the people that are coming here, they're family units that came for religious freedom. They don't want to go back to England where they were persecuted for their religious beliefs. And they're coming as family units. So they're going to cooperate. If my family's suffering and I have little kids, you might help me out the same way that if I saw you suffering and maybe not growing enough food or coming upon hard times, I'd help you out. If a family had a husband that died and it left a widow with orphans, the rest of us might help to take care of them, because we came with a sense of religious purpose, of communal purpose, just like John Winthrop said in the model of Christian charity. So we're going to cooperate. We're going to help our Christian brothers and sisters. So we're going to take care of orphans, widows, help each other out when we're having a hard time. So the idea of permanence, right? They have no intention of going back. Where you might put over here, you could put this idea, they have more of a sense of temporary status. I spelled that wrong too. Temporary status. At least initially, right? This changes as time goes on, but these initial settlers that came over had the idea they're going to come to America, get rich, go back to England. They weren't necessarily looking to start a new world or, a new civilization. So we have some differences there between that come from their motives and who came, right? So we have our cause up here, it leads to our effect down here, right? Different ways that people live. Another thing we could look at here might be the impact of the environment. How geography affects them, environment. So we think about the environment in the Chesapeake was warmer. They had warmer weather, longer growing seasons. They had, for resources, rich farmland, fertile farmland. In New England, we have some differences. We have colder weather. We had more rocky soil. First we'll compare here shorter seasons. So a shorter growing season. And we had more rocky soil. So how do those things relate to geography, or I'm sorry, how do those things relate to the different developments of their societies? We could look at this map here showing the economic activities that come about, and this is a little bit later though, this is in the 1750s, right, the southern colonies. If we look at what this map is showing us, we have a lot of area in purple dedicated to tobacco, right? So this is all gonna be about tobacco growing, excuse me, tobacco growing. John Rolfe he comes up with he blends a Spanish variety with a native variety of tobacco, makes it more pleasurable or more, desirable for people to want to smoke or chew, and it becomes the cash crop of the northern southern colonies, right, the Chesapeake area. But even down the southern places, we have rice indicated by red, rice and indigo, growing here on the coast. So we could look at the climate and the environment of the southern colonies leads to the idea of cash crops, right, crops that you're going to grow not to eat or consume, but to sell for profit. Even in the western parts of this area, you can look out here, there's furs and skins out in the Appalachians. There's areas where they're going to have cattle and grain, but for the most part, this is going to be driven by the cash crops. So we could put onto our chart here, we're thinking about effects. Put this in green, keep that in green. We could say they're going to be a cash crop driven economy. So everything's going to be pushed towards that. Think about what that means for life and why these societies develop differently. If you're going to grow lots of cash crops like tobacco and rice and indigo and later cotton, you're going to need labor for that. So this is going to lead to much more of a presence of indentured servants of it initially. The idea of servitude is going to be more prevalent in the South than it is in the North, and definitely slaves. And we'll see in a later video why slaves become the main source of labor eventually, even though they started off with indentured servants. If we look at New England and how their environment impacts them, we could look at this map and see that there's not a whole lot of farming going on. I mean, there's a little bit. There's cattle and grain in some of these areas, and parts of southern New England, furs and skins will be the big thing, and up in northern Maine. But really, they're driven by what they had for resources. They have lots of fish. They have lots of timber, which can be used to make boats, and they can become mercantile. See on here rum, indicated by these barrels. Rum will be an alcoholic beverage made from the sugar from the West Indies. So we can see New England, it's more about trade and not quite, I guess maybe manufacturing a little bit when you think about turning sugar into rum, but really it's about trade, right? Catching fish for survival, but also being able to sell that salted fish back to Europe who have depleted their fish sources. Making rum from the sugarcane, selling it to Europe for an inflated amount of money. Building ships both for their mercantile fleet, but also to help the British. So we're going to see in New England, say the word mercantile down here. Reread that, I spelled it wrong. Let's use a different ink. Mercantile, they're going to be more of a mercantile industry or economy than we will see in the South. The South is going to have a lot of their own merchants. They're going to trade directly from their plantations. So we can look at how does this impact them. So we could say in the North, we have a mercantile economy. Which is, we know, is trade. They're going to be big trade partners with Britain. Because of that, you could also maybe put up here as a comparison how that affects them. We have less servants and slaves. Now, New England does have servants, indentured servants, and they have slaves. So it's sometimes wrong to think that they were above that morally and they didn't have any slaves. They had less just because it wasn't economically practical, right? If slaves or indentured servants didn't bring a lot of income to a mercantile economy, as they did in the South, where they would work the land and their labor equals profits. That just wasn't the case in the North. So there's far few slaves and servants in the North because it just wasn't economically feasible. And something else we can look at here, another cause and effect that would show these differences. And this can get really crazy because now we can start thinking about long-term causes, long-term effects, short-term causes, short-term effects. We could say here that I'm going to put like a little middle bracket in here. And we can think about this as being almost like an intermediate point, because we can say that with the Chesapeake, right? So we could say a cause When we look at some of these causes, the environment, warm, longer seasons, and more swampy area too. So we can maybe add that to our mix here. Is that in their environment, it was more, it was swampier, less fresh water, more tropical diseases. We could also put on here more conflict with Native Americans. So let's see, let me go back to yellow. We put another cause here, Native American interactions. In the Chesapeake, there was more conflict. Not to say that there wasn't more conflict in New England also, or there wasn't conflict, but there was less conflict. We could say in New England, maybe we could add to our environment, this is a healthier environment, less tropical diseases. They didn't have to worry about things like malaria as much. And if we look at Native Americans, we do know that there is conflict, right? There's a Pequot War, there's a King Philip's War. There's definitely conflict, but it didn't drain the New England population or their resources as much. So we could say less conflict. Not to say that they were great neighbors. In a lot of ways, they were terrible neighbors, but they tended to be better neighbors than in the South, in the Chesapeake, because there was less need for all that land for farming. That's really the cause of those conflicts. So we think about how this relates to stuff and how we can put in this middle column that we have younger men, not a lot of women coming. So we have an environment that's a little bit more dangerous and more conflict to the Native Americans. We could say an effect of that would be lower life expectancy, at least for quite a while. And we'll see this also in a later video about slavery. Why does slavery take over when it does and start to outnumber indentured servants? A lot of it has to do with life expectancy. But for this particular video, we're looking at life expectancy. This is kind of an effect. So we can think of this as, put that in here. This is an effect. Think about it that way. But in some ways, it's also a cause, because it would lower life expectancy. And the life expectancy in the Chesapeake, if you didn't pick it up from the reading, was horrible. It was like 80% in some years of people that went there died, especially for the first decade or so. Can you imagine the risk you're taking to go to the Chesapeake and have an 80% of chance of dying? 80% of the people that go would be dead within a year. And it gets a little bit better as time goes on, but it takes a while for that really to balance itself out. So that's an effect, but we could also think of that as being a cause, because how was lower life expectancy related to, or what's an effect of that? We could put on here things like less schools. So in the South, they really don't build a whole lot of schools, because in the South, if you're not going to live for very long, if kids aren't going to reach adulthood, then why educate them? We could also think of less schools maybe being an effect of also just the kind of work and the economy itself. So it might be, think of almost this idea of this cash crop economy leads to less schools, because their plantation life is going to dominate in the South. And if we look at a diagram of a plantation, this is just a drawing of one, and it doesn't show all the hundreds of acres of farmland, but on this plantation, you would have the great house or the big house where the landowner would live. So this would be the person that owns the land and owns the slaves. And on this plantation, you would see that, first of all, it's right on a river. This is the ideal place if you want to get a plantation, to have it on a river, so you can trade directly with British merchants. You don't need towns for that. You don't need a middleman. There's slave quarters, or there'd be servant quarters if there's indentured servants right here. They have a stable for the horses. They have a place to do laundry, a place to grow vegetables, because all the acres on the outskirts of this, all out here, this is all going to be dedicated to tobacco. They have a flour mill to grind their own flour, a carpenter, a blacksmith. This is a very self-contained place for people to live, for the plantation, or everything they need for, I shouldn't say everything, but almost everything they need is on this plantation. What you don't see is a school, because you're going to be brought up as if you're a young boy in the landowning class to run in the business of this plantation. So you need to be literate. You need to learn how to read and write. You need to know how to keep records and do books and do business. But there's not a need to educate all the workers. So imagine this has slave quarters, but imagine that's indentured servants at the time. We don't really need to educate them, because what difference does that make? A carpenter needs to learn his skills as a carpenter, but doesn't need to learn to read and write, or at least not much, very basic literacy. So there wasn't much of a need, because this way of life dominated in the South, to educate a great number of people. You could also think of geography being a factor of this too, because if this is hundreds of acres of land, and you had to walk to the next plantation, you might have to walk, a couple hours, maybe 2 or 3 hours to get to the next plantation and see another person that didn't live here. If you're riding a horse, maybe it's an hour. But either way, imagine if they had a school that was centrally located between a bunch of plantations and all the kids had to walk 2 or 3 hours to school or 2 or 3 hours back. That's not going to happen. People aren't going to do it. So the very kind of plantation nature of the South led to less schooling also. If we're going to look at New England, we have a difference there, right? We say we have higher or longer life expectancy. Sorry, excuse my bad handwriting, but I said it, so you know what I wrote. So this, you think this is an effect of things like the idea that we have family units coming, right? There's more women. So, I mean, naturally, you can't reproduce if you don't have men and women. So there's women coming in larger numbers. They're coming as families. So there's going to be more daughters born. They're going to have natural increase, and they're going to live longer also because of this better environment. The idea that it's healthier, there's less conflict in Native Americans, there's not as much tropical disease. You might also think about this idea that since they're living communally and cooperatively, because of these factors, that's going to lead to longer life expectancy too. They're going to take care of each other. So there's an effect in there. And you think about how that relates to this similar idea of schools. New England, they're going to have more schools. And they're going to have established towns. They're going to have much more of an idea of town life. And this drawing shows that. You can look at the things on this little diagram of a colonial New England town. We have all the houses. These would be the houses that people live in. So they're going to live in almost like little rows and streets. They're going to live near each other. They're going to have farmland, but the farmland, you notice, isn't necessarily always connected to a house. So here's a house here, but their farmland might be over here. So this area will be dedicated to them. They bought land, and this will be the land that they farm. So is farming going on, but this is what we might think of more as subsistence farming. Subsistence farming, right? Farming to grow enough food to survive, to eat, and maybe you have a little bit extra to trade or sell, but for the most part, you're growing for your survival because they're doing other things like selling fish or fishing and then selling the fish, making rum or cutting down trees on the timber, building ships. Those are the kind of things that people in New England are doing for wealth. So we have people that are growing food, so there is farmland here. But you also have the idea, look at like things in the middle of the town hall, where all the people in this town, dozens of people, hundreds of families are going to grow and they're going to live here, and they're going to go to the town hall to decide on their own personal matters. This is where they'll have town hall meetings and they'll express democracy. And we know democracy was limited in New England because it was only available to land-owning men that were members of the church. So in that Calvinist society, people that actually were deemed, at least initially, it changes out over time, but at least initially people that were determined to be saved by God and that day of predestination, they could vote. Now we have a church right in the middle, so everyone's going to go to the church. It's very much a center of this. They have a town or a village green where they could have meetings outdoors. They could have festival celebrations. And on these farmlands, they could have people growing food for themselves, but also they'd have strips available for other people. Like if, for instance, let me go to color here. If this is my strips, I might farm this strip and this strip and this strip for myself, and maybe I might farm a third strip to dedicate to a widow family or a poor family. So all the food grown in that strip might go to people that are in need. But you also notice, going back to why I went to this to start with, is the idea that there's a school, right? This town has a school. And they started passing laws in New England that said if you have 50 or more families, you had to have some of the money from taxes, or just everyone had to dedicate money to a school teacher to pay the salary of a school teacher. If you had 100 or more families, you had to actually build a school. So why is school important? Because of things like reading the Bible. How can you be a literate? How can you be a good Christian if you're not literate and you can't read the Bible? And remember, this is part of Protestant groups, right? So they had the idea that they should read the Bible. Scripture was the sole source of authority, not priests or the church. So they have to read the Bible, go right to the Word of God if they're going to not rely on a priest to interpret it for them. So in New England, we have a lot more schools. And why is it also life expectancy? If kids are going to live much longer in New England, then they're going to need an education. We can also think about you read about in the book that New Englanders, they say, invented grandparents. I think that's in chapter 3. The idea that they don't really invent the idea of grandparents, but in New England you were far more likely to meet and know your grandparents and grow up with them than you were in the Chesapeake, and even more so in most places in Europe. So there's a lot more people living around. The population will be much higher, and they're going to need schools to educate all these people. There's an example from one of the New England school books, and you can see that they would teach the letters with little rhyming things, and oftentimes they would have moral lessons in them. So you have the letter A. A is in Adam's fall, we all sinned, right? So an A for Adam. Adam sinned, ate the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and we all have original sin because of that. B is for the Bible. Life to mend this book attend. B, well, I guess B is for book, but this book is the Bible. A dog will bite a thief at night, so don't steal because a dog will bite. D for dog. So anyway, they have this throughout, through a whole reader that they would have, and then kids would learn their ABCs and how to spell and how to read through these moral lessons. But you see this in New England and no place else, at least initially, because they had kids that were living longer and there was more need to educate them. So we look at all this information. This is somewhat of a comparison chart, right? Differences between the Chesapeake over here and New England over here, but really what we're looking at is cause and effect. So if we were writing this essay, if this was a long essay question on the AP exam, it wouldn't be enough just to list and identify the differences in both of these columns. We'd have to explain the connection between, this is really the difference down here, right? What was it like to live in these societies? How were these societies different? And how did these things lead to those differences? We have to explain the connection between those. And it can be complicated because some of these things you might argue are effects of the first group, but they're also causes of things that happen later. But being able to explain clearly all these, the connection between these causes and effects, and identify what are causes, what are effects for each group is going to be key on the AP exam.